Have you ever been in a conversation that suddenly feels like it's wrapping invisible wires around your chest, and you realize mid-sentence, mid-smile, that you need to leave not in 5 minutes or after this drink, but now, immediately, even though there's no emergency, no conflict, nothing you could point to and say, this is why? The other person is still talking, still animated, still waiting for your response, and you're nodding, you're making the right facial expressions, but underneath your skin something ancient and urgent is screaming for the exit. You can feel your nervous system starting to fray at the edges, your attention scattering like startled birds, and the only thought that makes sense anymore is, I have to go. And yet inside you, there's no anger, no crisis, no dramatic rupture. Just this overwhelming need for extraction that you can't fully explain even to yourself. You might manufacture a reason, a headache, an early morning, a forgotten obligation. You might disappear into the bathroom and seriously consider whether you could just slip out without saying goodbye at all. What confuses you most isn't the urge to leave. It's how totalizing it becomes, how it overrides social contracts and affection and the very real knowledge that this will hurt or confuse someone you might actually care about. But the need for space, for silence, for the absence of another person's presence becomes more urgent than almost anything else. You wonder if something is wrong with you, if emotionally healthy people don't feel trapped by connection this way, if normal relationships don't periodically require complete vanishing acts. You've heard the accusations before. Avoidant, commitment-phobic, emotionally unavailable, ghosting, flaky. Each word lands with a particular shame because you can't quite defend yourself without sounding cold or broken. You know how it looks. You know the hurt you've caused by disappearing from friendships, relationships, group chats, entire social ecosystems without explanation or warning. But what if this isn't emotional dysfunction or cruelty or even avoidance in the way most people understand it? What if this is actually a nervous system protecting itself with the only language it knows, withdrawal, silence, disappearance, not because you don't care, but because your capacity for human connection operates on a fundamentally different frequency than most people realize? What you're about to discover is that the urge to disappear without explanation isn't a character flaw. It's a survival response, and understanding where it comes from changes everything. When someone asks why you suddenly stopped responding to texts or why you canceled plans at the last minute or why you were so present for weeks and then just vanished, and your answer is some version of, I just needed space, the silence that follows is rarely understanding. It's confusion. Sometimes it's hurt. Often it's judgment. The social expectation is that closeness should breed more closeness, that if you care about someone you want to be near them, that absence requires justification proportional to the void it creates. They think you're selfish, taking what you need from connection and discarding people when they become inconvenient. They think you're scared, running from intimacy the moment it asks something of you. They think you're immature, incapable of adult communication, unwilling to do the hard work of relationships. They think you don't value them, that they're dispensable, that whatever you disappeared to do matters more than they do. And because our culture treats consistent availability as the price of admission to relationship, your disappearing acts get interpreted as rejection, abandonment, or emotional cowardice. What's rarely considered is that the need to disappear isn't about the person you're withdrawing from. It's about the legy weight of presence itself. The lack of explanation isn't because you don't care enough to give one. It's because the act of explaining would require more presence, more engagement, more energy than you have left. This isn't indifference. It's depletion. But disinterest isn't rejection. And needing solitude isn't the same as not loving people. What looks like avoidance from the outside is often just a nervous system trying desperately to recalibrate. To understand this, we have to step back to something most people don't think about when they're analyzing relationship patterns. Human beings are the only species that maintains continuous social connection outside of immediate survival needs. Our ancestors lived in tribes, yes, but tribal life included natural rhythms of togetherness and separation. Hunting parties that left for days, seasonal migration patterns, sleep cycles that created guaranteed solitude. Modern life has stripped those natural separations away. We're reachable 24 hours a day. Social media creates the expectation of constant relational availability. Even solitude is often interrupted by notifications, messages, the ambient awareness that someone might need something from you at any moment. Inside your brain, There's a structure called the amygdala that acts as your threat detection system, and it doesn't distinguish particularly well between physical danger and social demands that exceed your capacity. When you're overstimulated, when you've been on for too long, when you've performed connection beyond your nervous system's threshold, your amygdala starts firing stress signals. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thought and social behavior, begins to go offline. You enter what's called sympathetic activation, fight or flight mode. And for some people, flight doesn't mean running. It means disappearing. For many people, social interaction is genuinely energizing. Their nervous systems are wired to seek connection, to regulate through relationship, to feel restored by togetherness. But for you, connection is often regulatory work. It requires monitoring, reading the room, tracking emotional shifts, managing your presentation, staying attuned to others' needs. This isn't conscious or manipulative. It's how your nervous system learned to stay safe. And here's what matters. If connection is regulatory work rather than regulatory relief, then the math is completely different. You're not avoiding intimacy. You're conserving the resources required to engage with it at all. Long before most people learn that relationships are supposed to feel safe and nourishing, some children learn something else instead. That other people are unpredictable, that closeness comes with surveillance, that being known means being vulnerable to disappointment or judgment or expectation you can't meet. Maybe you grew up in a household where your emotional states were monitored a little too closely, where a parent's mood could shift the entire atmosphere, where you learned to read faces and vocal tones like weather patterns. Maybe you learned early that your needs were secondary to keeping the peace, that expressing discomfort created more problems than it solved, that the safest version of yourself was a carefully managed one. When you grow up in an environment where connection feels conditional or where attention feels intrusive rather than nourishing, your nervous system develops what psychologists call hypervigilance, a constant background scanning for threat, even in safe situations. You become extraordinarily attuned to other people's emotional states, often at the expense of your own. You learn to perform stability even when you're dysregulated inside. And here's the crucial part. This adaptation is brilliant, kept you safe. It helped you navigate an environment where emotional unpredictability was the norm. Your nervous system learned that the best way to avoid overwhelm wasn't to ask for less. It was to disappear before the request could even be made. This is why you can be deeply present with someone for hours, days, weeks, genuinely engaged, authentically connected, and then suddenly hit a threshold where one more text feels impossible, where the thought of seeing them again creates a low-grade panic you can't name. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that your capacity reservoir emptied. And unlike people whose nervous systems regulate through connection, yours regulates through absence. You're not withdrawing from the person. You're withdrawing to recalibrate your entire system, to discharge the accumulated stimulation, to return to yourself after extending outward for longer than your wiring comfortably allows. These patterns follow you into adult relationships, friendships, even professional dynamics. You might be the person everyone describes as warm and engaged when you're present but mysteriously absent for weeks at a time. You might oscillate between deep intimacy and complete radio silence, leaving people confused about where they stand. You might genuinely love someone and still need to vanish from their life periodically without explanation because explaining would require the very energy you no longer have. And the guilt of this, the awareness that you're hurting people who don't understand that this isn't about them, becomes its own burden, another weight your nervous system has to carry. Beneath the pattern of disappearing, there's a layer most people never admit to carrying: shame. Not the loud, obvious shame of having done something visibly wrong, but the quiet, chronic shame of suspecting that the way you're built is somehow deficient. You've internalized the message that emotionally mature people don't need to vanish, that if you really love someone you'd want to be near them consistently, that your periodic need for total absence is evidence of your inability to do relationships correctly. You watch other people maintain steady, consistent connection and wonder what's broken in you that you can't. In a culture that treats constant availability as evidence of care and withdrawal as evidence of indifference, your nervous system's need for cycling between connection and solitude gets pathologized. You're labeled avoidant, as if fear is the only possible explanation for needing space. You're called a ghoster, as if cruelty is the motivation rather than depletion. You're told you have commitment issues, as if the problem is that you won't commit rather than that the terms of commitment demand a type of continuous presence your system literally cannot sustain. The shame thrives because the framework itself is wrong. But you don't know that, so you internalize it as personal failure. But shame thrives on misattribution, on believing that your nervous system's protective mechanisms are character flaws. Here's the reframe that matters. Disappearing without explanation isn't emotional cowardice. It's a regulatory strategy developed by a system that learned connection requires more resources than it could reliably access. This isn't cruelty. It's conservation, not manipulation. Self-preservation, not rejection of others. Protection of self. The people you disappear from aren't less important. They're just on the other side of an equation where presence has become unsustainable and absence is the only language your nervous system knows for, I've exceeded my capacity. You're not failing to love people correctly. You're loving them from within a nervous system that was wired differently, that requires solitude not as escape but as recalibration, that needs silence not because sound is threatening but because your sensors are overwhelmed. There's nothing defective about needing to withdraw to survive. There's nothing broken about a system that prioritizes its own sustainability. You're allowed to need what you need even when what you need is to disappear. For many people, relationships are the primary site of nervous system regulation. They feel calmer around others. They process emotions through talking. They restore their sense of self through mirroring and validation from people they trust. Connection, for these individuals, is literally how they come back to baseline. Their capacity for intimacy grows through consistent presence because presence is what fills their wells. But disappearing without explanation isn't about avoiding intimacy or refusing connection. It's about operating from a completely different regulatory system. Where some people refill through relationship, you refill through solitude. Where some people discharge stress by talking, you discharge it through silence. Where others restore themselves by being known, you restore yourself by being unknown, unwitnessed, unseen, not forever but periodically, in cycles that match your actual capacity rather than social expectations. The space isn't empty. It's occupied by the work of integration, by nervous system recalibration, by the return to yourself that makes future presence possible. Neither path is superior. Both are valid human strategies for navigating the intensity of being alive and connected. What matters isn't whether you regulate through togetherness or solitude. What matters is whether you're operating from understanding or shame, whether you're honoring your actual needs or performing someone else's template. You haven't opted out of connection. You've concentrated your relational energy into bursts of genuine presence rather than sustained performance. And for some people, that quality of attention, intense, authentic, undivided when you're there, is worth the absence that follows. When you step back and look at the whole picture, the childhood adaptation, the nervous system wiring, the regulatory strategy, the cultural misunderstanding, what emerges isn't a story of dysfunction but a story of survival and difference. Your pattern of disappearing isn't evidence that you can't love people or sustain connection. It's evidence that you learned early to protect your capacity for connection by cycling between presence and absence, by withdrawing before resentment or depletion could damage what matters. It's evidence of a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep you functional. People who disappear without explanation aren't emotionally unavailable or commitment-phobic or avoidant in the simple, pathologized sense those words usually carry. They're individuals whose regulatory systems require solitude to sustain connection, whose capacity for intimacy is real but finite, who need the freedom to withdraw not because they don't care but because they care enough to preserve their ability to show up authentically when they return. Your disappearing acts aren't abandonment. They're the price of remaining yourself inside relationships that would otherwise consume you. And if you're ready, if the cost of this pattern has become too high, if you want to experiment with different strategies, you can. Nervous systems aren't fixed. They're adaptive. You can learn to communicate needs before you hit empty, to set boundaries that create space without disappearing, to find relationships with people who understand that your love language includes periodic absence. But that's a choice you get to make from understanding, not shame. From self-knowledge, not deficiency. If this video put words to something you felt but never quite articulated, if you've ever disappeared from someone's life and wondered whether that made you a bad person, you're not alone. This pattern is more common than the silence around it suggests, and understanding where it comes from is the first step toward either accepting it or choosing differently. I'd love to hear your experience. Drop a comment and share. What does your nervous system do when connection starts feeling like too much? How do you navigate the space between honoring your needs and honoring your relationships? And if you want more conversations like this, about the quiet patterns of the human mind, the things we carry but don't usually name, the psychology hiding beneath behaviors we've learned to judge, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore these spaces together, without shame, with curiosity and compassion. You're not broken. You're human. And that's exactly enough.